This here is just the dry stem without the doubling technique.
I wanna be free, yeah. It'll never be the same.
Okay, a bit of a tail there from that reverb coming from that synth, but here is the vocal double.
I wanna be free, yeah. It'll never be the same.
And there's some other bits and pieces I've done to this doubling auxiliary send as well. So let's dive into how I put this together.
You're listening to the Inside the Mix podcast with your host, Mark Matthews.
Hello, folks, and welcome to the Inside the Mix podcast. If you are a new listener, a big welcome. Make sure you hit that follow button on your podcast player of choice. And if you're watching this on YouTube, make sure you hit subscribe and that notification bell so you get notified of new episodes. And to the returning listeners, a big welcome back. So in this episode, I'm going to demonstrate one of my favorite vocal production techniques. And I use this to add a bit of night and day, a bit of contrast, a bit of excitement when I'm moving from one section to another, say from a verse into a chorus. And this particular technique uses the waves doubler. So it's a vocal doubling technique. So let's dive in. So we're here in Logic Pro, and this is a session I'm working on at the moment. It is sort of like a house track. It's really in its infancy. But I've got this vocal sample in here, and I'm going to demonstrate this technique. So this is what the vocal sounds like without the vocal double technique. Now this vocal, I must say, this actual sample, there is no processing apart from this doubling going on here. So there's nothing been applied to this whatsoever. So it's the dry vocal stem with some doubling. So this here is just the dry stem without the doubling technique.
I wanna be free, yeah. It'll never be the same.
Okay, a bit of a tail there from that reverb coming from that synth, but here is the vocal double.
I wanna be free, yeah. It'll never be the same.
Sounds pretty cool, right? Now, ultimately, there is the unconscious bias of louder is better because using this vocal doubling technique, there is an increase in signal level coming from the vocal, not from the vocal sample, but from the auxiliary send where the doubler is. So we're going to have an overall increase of level of that vocal. But in the grand scheme of things, it just makes it wider. And there's some other bits and pieces I've done to this doubling auxiliary send as well. So let's dive into how I put this together. Here we are in the mixer window, and the first thing we need to do is create a new auxiliary channel strip. So we go to options and create new auxiliary channel strip. I'm going to immediately delete it because I don't need it. I've already got one set up. And it's called Vox Doubler. And on there, I've got the Waves Doubler 4. It's the stereo version, as I don't need the dual mono. I don't need discrete control over the individual mono signals. So here I'm using the basic doubler preset, making sure that the center signal is disabled as we only need the left and right. I'm going to leave the pan positions as they are, and I like the delay settings as well. You've got slight differentiation between the left and right, 7.3 on the left, and it is 10 on the right, because we don't want them exactly the same. It just adds to that unique sound in the left and right and adding to that stereo experience. And everything else we can leave as is. So next in my signal chain, after the doubler, I've got the Logic Pro channel EQ. Now you can use any EQ, whichever one you want to use. You may well say, well, why don't you use the EQ in the doubler? And for me, the UI is too small. I could make it bigger, yes, or I could just open another EQ and have more discrete control, because you've only got two possible sort of control options here. You've got two nodes, as it were, that you can control. So I clicked on it then, it's just going to make sure it's disabled. So I'd rather just use an EQ here to be a separate EQ. So in here, I've got a first order slope rolling off some low frequency information below 100 Hertz. And then I've got a low shelf as well, set at about 300 Hertz, some sort of low mid information that I just want to get rid of. And I've got a -3 in terms of reduction there of those frequencies. And then kind of the opposite, it's like top and tail, at about 4.5 kilohertz, where the vocal sounds most sweet to me. I swept through and found this sort of presence frequency of this vocal. I've boosted it by 3 dB because I just want to sweeten the left and right in the stereo field for this vocal. Next, we have the vocal channel or vocal track itself. And on there, I've got an auxiliary send set to post fader going to the Vox doubler auxiliary channel. And I've changed it from post pan, which is the default, because I like to use post fader unless otherwise. You could leave it on post pan because this vocal is only ever going to be down the middle anyway. So it wouldn't really make any difference, but that's just the way I like to work. I like to know that it's in post fader unless I choose otherwise. And then option click on the send level to get it to 0. And then I'm using the actual channel strip fader of the auxiliary send to control the amount of doubler effect that I am having here. Before we do that, if you want to learn more about when to use pre and post fader sends, check out episode 129 of the Inside the Mix podcast, where I go through that in more detail. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag the auxiliary channel strip fader all the way down to 0. And then whilst it's playing, I'm going to bring that level up until it's just tucked underneath the vocal. So let's give it a go.
I wanna be free, yeah. It'll never be the same. I wanna be free, yeah. It'll never be the same.
There we go. So I've got it set to, well, it says -3.9, but I like it to be nice and even. So I'm going to put a -4. So it's just tucked underneath. And then I could automate that level, so I'm going to have more of the doubling effect in the chorus and maybe the build. I could automate the level in the build to gradually increase and then actually strip it back during the verse. And to just automate this auxiliary channel strip, I would just right click and create track basically, and then I could perform automation like I would any other track. So, I mean, alternatively, you could automate the send level coming from the track itself. So that's another way that you could do it. And maybe there's a use case to say, or an argument to say that's a better way of doing it, but this is just the workflow I use. So you've got a choice, essentially. But there we go, folks. That is the Vox doubler effect. So let's play it again like we did at the beginning without the doubler effect.
I wanna be free, yeah. It'll never be the same.
And this is with.
I wanna be free, yeah. It'll never be the same. I wanna be free, yeah. It'll never be the same.
There we go, folks. That is a very low reverb tail on that synth. I really do need to do something about that. But it is a demo, and I'll tackle that further down the line. Anyway, that is a really quick and easy vocal doubling technique. Now, you could use any stereo imaging or imagery or doubling plugin. You just need to be able to disable that center signal. So, folks, give it a go.